She was born into chains, told she was property, that her life was not her own, but a ledger entry, a tool, a voice not meant to be heard. Her name was Elizabeth Freeman. Most knew her as Mum Bett, but history should remember her as something else, a precedent. Because in 1781, decades before emancipation, before the Civil War, before the world was ready, she made a decision that would shake the legal foundation of a slaveholding society. She was a black woman, enslaved, illiterate, but not unknowing. She heard the words of a new constitution. All men are born free and equal. And she asked a question the system never expected. Does that include me? Then she did something almost no one, white or black, had ever done. She sued her enslaver in a court of law, and won. In a time when women had no legal personhood, when slavery was routine, and when power was inherited, not earned. Elizabeth Freeman rewrote the script. She didn't beg for mercy. She didn't wait for revolution. She used the law against the very system that used it to imprison her. This is not a story of charity or luck. It's a story of legal genius, moral clarity, and a woman who believed that if a law could be written, it could be tested, and if a right was named, it could be claimed. Elizabeth Freeman didn't just fight for herself. She carved a path for generations to follow, in a courtroom that was never meant to hear her. This is her story, and this episode is for anyone who's ever been told, "You don't belong here." Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to believe it. Chapter 1: Life as Property in a Post-Revolution America. To understand Elizabeth Freeman's courage, you have to understand what she was up against. She was born around 1744 in Claverack, New York, enslaved. No birth certificate, no last name, no rights. To the law, she wasn't a woman. She was property, bought, sold, inherited. She ended up in Massachusetts, owned by the Ashley family, wealthy, respected, and brutal. In the Ashley household, she worked endlessly, cooking, cleaning, laboring, not paid, not thanked. Her body was not her own. Neither was her time. Her silence was expected. Her obedience demanded. Slavery in the North is often erased from memory, as if it didn't exist, as if only Southern fields knew chains. But in 18th century Massachusetts, slavery was real, common, legal. Enslaved people served wealthy families, built cities, and raised children, without recognition, without freedom. And yet, while America spoke of liberty, freedom was not yet a birthright. It was a privilege, granted to white men, while others were written out of the national dream. The contradiction was deafening. Men fought British rule in the name of freedom, while keeping others bound under their feet. They declared independence, while denying it to the women and black people who made their lives possible. Elizabeth Freeman lived inside this contradiction. She saw the hypocrisy up close. She cleaned the homes of men who wrote about equality. She served the families who spoke of natural rights, while holding her like livestock. But oppression doesn't always destroy the mind. Sometimes it sharpens it. Freeman was not permitted education, but she listened. She watched. She understood more than anyone realized. Her body was chained by law, but her mind was awake. She knew that something was shifting in the colonies, that the air was full of arguments about justice and liberty. And while those arguments were not meant for her, she heard them anyway. She did not yet have a plan, but she had awareness. And that was the beginning of her revolution. Because before a law can be challenged, someone must first believe they deserve its protection. Elizabeth Freeman did. And what she would do next would turn the law against itself and force the country to look in the mirror it had tried so hard to avoid. Chapter 2: The moment she hears the Constitution and makes a decision. Sometimes history pivots not with an army, but with a sentence. For Elizabeth Freeman, that sentence came not from a preacher or a rebel or a politician. It came from the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, a newly inked document declaring a radical idea. All men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights. She heard those words, spoken aloud in her enslaver's home, a legal concept floating in a room where her humanity was still unrecognized. But she didn't dismiss it as empty rhetoric. She didn't assume it didn't apply to her. She asked a question that would change everything. If all men are born free and equal, then why am I still enslaved? That question wasn't just philosophical, it was legal and dangerous. Because to ask it out loud as an enslaved Black woman was to challenge the very foundation of society. Freeman didn't yell. She didn't protest in the streets. Instead, she made a decision. She would put the Constitution on trial. The irony was sharp. The very system that enslaved her claimed to be founded on freedom. So she would test it, not with rebellion, but with the law. This was not just an act of bravery. It was an act of profound legal intelligence. She understood that words in a constitution meant nothing, unless someone forced the courts to interpret them. And if that someone could be a poor, Black, enslaved woman, then everyone would have to reconsider what justice really meant. With the help of Theodore Sedgwick, a lawyer and abolitionist, she filed a lawsuit against her enslaver, John Ashley, in a case that would become known as Mum Bett versus Ashley. She was not looking for sympathy. She wasn't asking for favors. She was making a legal argument that the Constitution had already declared her free, and the state was violating its own laws by keeping her in bondage. No protest signs, no armies, just one woman, armed with the very language her oppressors had written. In that moment, Elizabeth Freeman became more than a servant, more than a victim, more than even a survivor. She became a litigant and a visionary. And as her case moved toward trial, so did the moral reckoning of a nation built on contradictions. Because if she was right, then slavery itself was on trial, and the Constitution would have to choose, live up to its promises, or admit they were never meant for her. Chapter 3, Taking Her Enslaver to Court and Shocking the System. Courtrooms in 1781 weren't built for women like Elizabeth Freeman. They were built to protect property, to enforce contracts, to uphold order. And Elizabeth was, legally, still considered property. But when she entered the Berkshire County Court with her lawyer, Theodore Sedgwick, she was not asking for permission. She was making a claim. A claim that her very existence, her labor, her breath, her will, was protected by the same Constitution her oppressors invoked to declare their independence. The court didn't know what to do with her. There had been no case like this before. A Black woman, enslaved, suing her white enslaver, not for mistreatment, but for her freedom. On constitutional grounds. This wasn't rebellion. This wasn't escape. It was a legal challenge aimed at the core of slavery's logic. Sedgwick laid out the argument. The Massachusetts Constitution clearly stated that all men are born free and equal. Therefore, no person, regardless of race, could be held in bondage. It was elegant, undeniable, and dangerous. Because if the court agreed, it wouldn't just be freeing one woman. It would be undermining the legal basis for slavery across the entire state. Ashley's defense? That Elizabeth was his legal property, that slavery had always existed, that tradition, profit, custom should prevail. But the court listened, and more importantly, it read. The Constitution wasn't symbolic anymore. It was being interpreted in real time. And when the judges ruled in Elizabeth's favor, they did something extraordinary. They didn't just free her, they set a precedent. The ruling made it clear slavery was incompatible with Massachusetts' new founding principles, and if one woman could prove it, then so could others. It wasn't long before similar lawsuits followed. Within 2 years, slavery in Massachusetts collapsed under its own contradictions. Elizabeth Freeman's case cracked the legal foundation of bondage. With clarity, strategy, and a belief in words most people thought were theoretical. She didn't shout in anger. She didn't plead for pity. She showed up calmly, with the law in her hand, and dared the system to live up to its own ideals. In doing so, she didn't just win her freedom. She exposed the hypocrisy of a nation that had declared liberty for all, while chaining its own people. And she proved that justice isn't given. It's claimed by those brave enough to demand it. Chapter 4. Winning her freedom and becoming a symbol of legal resistance. When the court ruled in her favor, Elizabeth Freeman didn't just walk out a free woman. She walked out as proof. Proof that the law, if wielded with courage and precision, could be made to serve those it was never intended to protect. Proof that resistance doesn't always come through rebellion. Sometimes it comes through legal clarity. Her victory was quiet. No parades, no declarations from Congress, no official apology from the man who had enslaved her. But it rippled. Because once the court ruled that Elizabeth Freeman could not legally be held in bondage, they had cracked the door open for others. Her case, Mum Bett vs. Ashley, became part of a wave of legal challenges across Massachusetts. Slaves began to question their status. Lawyers began to reconsider the Constitution's scope. And soon, the practice of slavery in Massachusetts couldn't stand on precedent, because the precedent now stood with her. She didn't just change her life, she changed the law. And in doing so, she became more than a freed woman. She became a symbol. People who had never heard her name soon lived in a state without slavery because of her. And though she could have disappeared into private life, she chose something more powerful. She continued to live as an example. She took a paid position in the household of the Sedgwick family, not as a servant, but as a respected employee, caretaker, and friend. She earned wages. She owned property. She raised her children as free citizens. And she was known in her community not as Mum Bett, the former slave, but as Elizabeth Freeman, a woman who had forced the law to call her by her name, long before abolition was mainstream, long before activism had language. She showed the country what legal resistance looked like. Not with riots, not with slogans, but with documents, with courtrooms, with a belief that justice, if real, must be universal, or it is not justice at all. Her story became a quiet anthem for the abolitionist movement. Her case was cited, her courage repeated, her name whispered in places where chains still clinked in the dark. Because once one woman claims freedom through the law, every lie used to uphold slavery begins to unravel. Chapter 5. Her legacy in the abolitionist movement. Elizabeth Freeman never wrote a manifesto. She didn't lead protests. She didn't stand at podiums demanding change. And yet, she became the blueprint. Her story was passed down quietly at first, not through mass media, but through memory, in parlors, in courtrooms, in whispered conversations among abolitionists who needed proof that resistance wasn't theoretical, that it had already happened. By the time the abolitionist movement gained national momentum in the 19th century, Elizabeth Freeman's case had become a foundational reference. She was often cited as the first enslaved black woman in America to successfully sue for her freedom and win. Her case laid legal groundwork, not just for Massachusetts, but for the moral architecture of the movement itself. Because while many activists fought for emancipation through politics or religion, Freeman had already proved the point in court. She showed that the ideas of freedom and equality weren't just abstract ideals. They could be activated, used as legal tools to dismantle the system from within. Abolitionists pointed to her case to show the hypocrisy of a constitution that allowed slavery in one state, while declaring liberty in another. And Black Americans, free and enslaved, looked to her story as evidence that change was possible, not just with hope, but with strategy. Her victory echoed in the voices of future fighters, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. It provided a precedent, not just legal, but spiritual. A reminder that dignity isn't granted by law, it's asserted by those brave enough to demand recognition under it. She lived the rest of her life as a free woman in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, working, parenting, advising, never seeking fame, but earning deep respect. And when she died in 1829, she was buried in the Sedgwick family plot, an unthinkable honor for a Black woman in that era. Her gravestone reads, "She was born a slave and remained a slave for nearly 30 years. She could neither read nor write. Yet in her own sphere, she had no superior or equal. She neither wasted time nor property. She never violated a trust, nor failed to perform a duty. In every situation of domestic trial, she was the most efficient help and the most tender friend. History tried to forget her, but her actions wouldn't allow it. She stood at the crossroads of law and liberation and walked forward when no path existed. She didn't just help end slavery in one state, she modeled how to challenge it in all of them. And in doing so, Elizabeth Freeman became not just a freedwoman, but a foremother of justice. Elizabeth Freeman didn't wait to be saved. She didn't ask politely. She didn't wait for society to be ready. She heard 13 words. All men are born free and equal. And she made them real. She didn't come from wealth. She couldn't read or write. She had no legal status, no citizenship, no protection. But she had something else, an unshakable sense of her own worth. And that was enough to challenge the system, to walk into a courtroom where the law called her property, and force it to call her person. She didn't just win her freedom. She changed the law. She changed the precedent. And she changed what it meant to be an American, in a country still learning to live up to its own promises. Her story is not just a footnote in Black history, it's a mirror. For anyone who has ever been told they don't belong, that the rules don't apply to them, that the system is too big, too fixed, too powerful to challenge. Elizabeth Freeman's life says otherwise. She shows us that the moment you decide to believe, the law applies to you, your humanity, your dignity, your future. You step out of invisibility and into history. And here's the truth. Systems do not dismantle themselves. They're challenged by people who believe they have the right to stand, even when the world tells them to sit. Elizabeth Freeman stood, and the ripple of that moment still moves through every courtroom, every freedom, every voice. That dares to say, I belong here. She didn't just free herself. She freed the idea of what's possible. And that is legacy.